My presentation today is about how a moderate severity fire altered spatial patterns in a ponderosa pine forest and subsequent regeneration. My co-authors include Justin Ziegler and Chad Hoffman from Colorado State University, plus my colleagues with me at the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Flagstaff, Jose Iniguez, or Pepe, Suzanne Owen, and Dana Muse, and my colleagues at the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Fort Collins, Paula Fornwalt and Mike Battaglia. Ponderosa pine forests were historically characterized by mixes of tree clumps, single trees, and openings. And I think it's really interesting across the range of ponderosa pine see how consistent this pattern is. These groups of single trees intermixed with small clumps and larger clumps and then really large clumps interspersed with openings. Most people attribute this spatial pattern to the historical high-frequency surface or mixed fire regimes under which these ponderosa pine ecosystems evolved. But really, in reality, direct evidence of how does this pattern establish is pretty limited. And this is partly because a lot of our information comes from small plot work, where, for example, you can look at what a fire does to tree density or basal area, but understanding how it affects these various size tree groups there's limited information out there. So that was one thing we thought we could add in this study, was information on how a fire actually affects spatial aggregation and the fate of various size tree groups. So amongst our questions about how a moderate severity fire edits spatial attributes, we start with the mortality process. And we asked, is tree mortality aggregated? And is it positively related to density? We are also curious about how spatial aggregation of the trees changes. We looked at pre-fire, post-fire, and then spatial aggregation of the regeneration. And finally, how does fire and regeneration change the distribution of these various size tree classes? We selected the 2000 pumpkin fire from a number of candidate fires. We were interested in giving the fire a chance to regenerate. So, we were looking at fires that were at least 10 years old. And we also wanted to find areas that had mixed severity, including some low, moderate, and even small patches of high severity fire. We established 3 4-hectare plots because, again, we are interested in spatial attributes. And the pumpkin fire is located northwest of Flagstaff in Arizona. Again, we had these large plots so that we could capture spatial patterns. We reconstructed the pre-fire forest from existing evidences. This would be stumps and logs, and we also stem mapped trees and stem mapped the post-fire regeneration. The analyses I'll present today are all point pattern analyses. Okay, let's look at our first question, and that is about the mortality pattern. 2 parts of this. The first part is mortality clustered or is it dispersed? So at this test, if there were more dead trees around dead trees than live trees around dead trees. And the second mortality question is mortality more prevalent in dense areas. In this test, if there were more trees around dead trees than around live trees. We found that mortality was both clustered and density dependent. This is an example of one of our plots. The red, or pink, I guess it is dead trees, and the green is the live trees. And we found definitely strong clustering of the mortality, and it was generally positively density dependent. So in other words, when density increased, mortality increased for the most part. But even though mortality rates were greater in denser neighborhoods, aggregation among surviving trees was not diminished. So again, this is an example of one of our plots pre-fire and post-fire. We found that aggregation, in fact, increased after the fire, likely because of the clustered pattern of the fire-killed trees. So the two plots on the top right there, pre-fire shows aggregation, post-fire, even stronger aggregation in the trees. The next question is the spatial relationship of the seedlings to surviving trees. We're interested in testing if the seedlings are attracted to, independent of, or inhibited by surviving trees. And what we found was aggregation was further intensified as regeneration established in dense patches away from surviving trees. This is one of our plots on the bottom left there. The green is the regeneration. The purple is the surviving trees, and the open circles are the dead trees. So you see a strong aggregation of the regeneration and a strong inhibition from the surviving trees, or at greater distances, total randomness. So this shows that the seedlings established away from the surviving trees. Finally, we looked at the group size analyses, and we identified tree groups using overlapping crowns, and we used the size categories that are commonly mentioned in other manuscripts. In other words, single trees, small groups of 2 to 4 trees, medium groups of 5 to 9, bigger ones 10 to 19, and 20 plus. So this might look a little complicated, but it really isn't. Let me walk you through this. So the light green is single trees, and with increasing darkness of the green, those are bigger tree groups. So the next one up from the singles is the 2 to 4, 5 to 9, so forth. The blue is the regeneration. Again, the shading indicates the size of the groups. And you can see both before and after the fire and following regeneration, single trees and small tree groups plus medium-sized groups prevailed. And I think this pattern is really interesting. On the right side there, that's the percentage of groups. So that's the scale there. So you can see it's pretty consistent, which is different than some recent papers have found. And also interesting to me is that the regeneration formed mostly new groups instead of mixing with existing groups. This was even true when we projected this into the future. So you look at the third bar there, the post-fire plus 10 years, that's immediately when the regeneration has, just established. And you see there's a tiny bit of mixing, that's the orangish color there. But in general, you see the blue bars are creating, this is the regeneration, is creating new groups. And what we did was assign the average attributes of the surviving trees to the regeneration so that we could project forward and look at, well, when they're babies, they're forming their own groups, but how does this pattern prevail? And we found even that when we projected this into the future, there was very little mixing. Approximately 10% of the tree groups formed by the regeneration were actually mixed with the existing forest, which I found very interesting. Most of them, again, independent. That same relative distribution, singles and small groups and medium groups and large. So in summary, how does a moderate severity fire alter spatial attributes? Tree mortality was aggregated and positively related to density. Trees were increasingly spatially aggregated, and the fire increased aggregation compared to pre-fire. Regeneration was also aggregated and inhibited by surviving trees. And what about tree group size classes? Single trees, small groups of 2 to 4 trees, and medium groups of 5 to 9 trees dominated. This is a consistent pattern from pre-fire to post-fire to the regeneration, and then projected growth of the regeneration into the future. Regeneration forms separate groups from the surviving trees for the most part. Approximately 10% of the groups formed by the regeneration were actually mixed with surviving trees. So in essence, we see the pattern here. We see the process contributing to the pattern where a moderate severity fire generated tree aggregation through the process of mortality, survival, and regeneration. And the regeneration largely occupied newly opened areas created by the fire, essentially reestablishing the pattern of the pre-fire forest. Which this means if there isn't a fire soon, we're back to where we started with this forest before the fire, because the regeneration has basically filled in everything that was edited out by the fire. I'd like to acknowledge our funding source, the Rocky Mountain Research Station National Fire Plan funding, and we had a lot of help in the field. Thank you especially to Scott Voida, Spencer Bueller, Jennifer Blanks, Katie Gibble, Patrick Cassidy, and Kimberly Isock. Chris Barrett was really helpful with our GIS questions. And if you have questions, you can use the chat box to ask them. And if you have thoughts or input, I'm very interested to hear it. And I want to thank you for listening to our presentation.